Welcome to a Creative Approach podcast. I'm your host, Karen Poirier-Brody. If you've listened to the show before, so nice to have you back. And if you're a new listener, it is so nice to have you here. At a Creative Approach podcast, we explore the life and thoughts of a creative guest each episode. Our interviews feature people from many areas of creativity, from fine arts to crafts, from literature to music, science to culinary exploration, and more. Today's guest is April Bey. April is an exciting visual artist and teacher. As I looked into her background, I discovered she teaches at a community college here in California, which is my favorite place to learn about art. I wish I lived closer to her and could take her classes. I love her dynamic and robust imagery and her exploration of contemporary issues in her art. Now, I've been slightly ambitious and optimistic about managing my health and the podcast. I remain passionate about my conversations with creative people and promise to do my best on releasing episodes every 3 to 4 weeks with summer and Christmas breaks. Sometimes, though, the best laid plans do go astray. No matter what, I love to bring these fascinating visits to you, and thank you for joining the conversations. Also, I hope you are pursuing your creative endeavors. My current explorations are computer art, ceramics, and mixed media. Storytelling is really important to me, and I like to bring history and stories into my art. I can't throw pots on a wheel because of my neck problems. It's just really too difficult, too painful. But I can slowly build pots. And as I've learned in art history, that's the way pottery originally began and continues with many hand-built potters making beautiful works. It's been exciting recently to receive so much encouragement on my designs. I like melding stories and history into my art, and that makes today's guest of particular interest to me, as April incorporates contemporary themes in her art, today's news, and tomorrow's history. I believe you'll enjoy learning more about her. Join me now as I chat with April about her creative approach. Hi.
Hello.
I'm so happy to have April Bey with me today on the podcast. She is an artist, and I love her work, and she's a teacher too, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that my listener would love to hear a little bit more about you. And I know a little bit from your blurb on the internet, but I was wondering how it is that you came to be an artist.
Yeah, so in grad school, when we were writing artist statements, my mentor would always say, never put the line, "I've been making art since I was a child," on your artist statement, because everyone makes art as a child. But she said what makes artists different is that they keep making art. And so that's kind of how it started realistically for me. I was always really into art. For Christmas and my birthday, I always asked for new paint and new colored pencils. I grew up in the Bahamas. And so in the Bahamas, in the school systems, at least until high school, art is a very prominent subject matter. In fact, one of our standardized tests that we have to take, the BGC, it tests you in fine art. Oh. So I was really, really into art. The fracture came when I realized after high school, there's really no careers in art in the Bahamas. And so that's kind of when my family was trying to figure out, well, obviously she doesn't want to work in hotels and she doesn't want to do banking. So how can we get her to the U.S.? So my mom is a U.S. citizen. So I was very lucky to be able to move to the U.S. and finish up my high school. And then I did my undergrad in the Midwest at Ball State. So I have a BFA in drawing. And then I did my master's out here in L.A. at CSUN.
Oh, so you kind of moved across the country. Was it?
Yeah.
So drawing was really your passion? Did you do your MFA in that subject as well?
My MFA is more in interdisciplinary painting. Uh-huh. So it's drawing and then painting. My studio practice is pretty much all over the place. Right now I'm doing a lot of sewing that's acting as drawing.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of
and
multimedia approaches in your art.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And so that's cool. And that just sort of evolved over time. How did you get to where you are in your art right now?
Well, I'm not really an illustrator. And so when I was in school, even though I have the skill to render and draw, the things I was wanting to address in my work didn't lend to that medium. And so it wasn't until I got to grad school where they were like, well, just make work in whatever medium you need to make work in. So I learned printmaking, ceramics, whatever. So I make work based on what the work means. So right now, my work is about West African textiles, how women run the trade there, and how their labor is often exploited, and Chinese neocolonialism. So I use materials from the actual continent. I use techniques that are similar to how the women work there, and that's how the work is being outputted now.
Oh, so just it was really what your goal that kind of directed what type of media you were working in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And when you started off in art, where did you think you were going to end up with that? Because you said your family said, well, there's no careers for her here in the Bahamas. So obviously, did you have some idea what you wanted to do early on?
My family was very supportive, but they were also pretty typical in that they wanted me to major in graphic design because they thought, that was the only field to make money. The other field that I was told in school you could get a consistent job was art education. So in undergrad, I initially majored in art education. However, I don't have the patience for children or even high schoolers. And my advisor at the time noticed that and was like, you would be much better suited for adults. And so he kind of shaped my education plan to go for the MFA but he also told me that I was a good artist. He was like, it would be a waste to just focus on teaching. You should be having a parallel career as well. And so I went to school mainly to develop my discipline and create work. And that has since turned into the other career I have, which is being an educator. So I started off like I think all art students start off trying to do what they love while also supporting themselves. But it just kind of morphed into what it was because I had really good advisors around me at the time.
That's really important, I think, is who's there to support you. And in spite of your family being a little skeptical about, where is she going to get a job? It sounds like they're very supportive.
Yeah, they are.
Uh-huh. And well, that's interesting how you got to where you are. Now you teach at a community college, I believe. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And how is that experience?
Well, I started teaching at CSUN, and then I moved to Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, which is very corporate, private, and expensive. I liked the freedom of teaching there because I could just write whatever class I wanted. So when I was there, I taught a class on Beyonce and feminism and compared that with process-based art. And at private schools, you don't have to have the credentials exactly to teach that course. You just have to prove that you're an expert in that course. So I had a lot of freedom. However, the student body was made up of a lot of students that had a hard time relating to the topics that we were going over. So for example, they were coming from wealthier families. So not really being able to understand or empathize with, Black women in poverty. So a friend of mine suggested I start looking at community colleges because the student body is I could relate to the student body a lot more. I grew up really, really poor and having to put myself through school. And a lot of my students now at CC are exactly the same as I am. They have really overbearing foreign parents who are like, you have to get this degree, you have to do this work. But at the same time, they're making work about really influential and heavy, deep topics, and they may not be able to afford supplies one week, but they're going to find workarounds. They're extremely creative, hardworking, and dedicated. And not that I didn't get a lot out of Art Center because I did, but at the CCs, you have more of 80% of the class is hardworking and just pushing so hard to make great work. Whereas at the private schools, you have a lot of students that are just kind of there because they might have been good at art in high school and they have a lot of money. So their parents are like, well, if you have to go to college, we're going to send you the best one. And they may not necessarily want to be there. So it's a different student dynamic. And that's what I like the most about the community colleges.
Yeah, well, I'm a community college student. I have been because I loved the art experience there. The teachers are
Hmm.
fabulous and they're really dedicated and they're doing a lot of the hands-on teaching. It's not just administrative, assistant kind of student
Yeah,
teacher things and
definitely.
stuff. They're right in there and it's a really good experience. So I'm glad you're enjoying teaching that and you're right, I think my fellow students are pretty dedicated to producing some good stuff.
Hmm.
So how long have you been at that job as teaching?
This is my fourth year, so I should be getting tenure this spring,
Oh, awesome.
hopefully.
And you said, well, your current work is exploring the textiles of Africa. And what sort of led you
Hmm.
to that? Because you're from the Caribbean.
Yeah.
How did you, I mean, I think textiles and stuff there are somewhat different, aren't they?
Well, I was making work about Black women and how they're perceived.
Uh-huh.
And so I know how Black women are perceived in the Bahamas and the Caribbean, right? And
Yeah.
a experience here in the US has taught me how Black women are perceived and how they go about life in the US. So I was like, well, I wrote a residency proposal to Todd Gray. He has a house in Ghana, and he told me that he was starting an artist residency. And so I wrote a proposal that I wanted to go and connect with women in actual Africa to see, because we're spawned from, we all come from Africa,
Oh,
but I
yeah.
wanted to see how women are treated, how women work and navigate through life on the actual motherland. And so I went there and naturally connected with a lot of women in the markets because that's primarily where they work. If not in white collar positions, they're in the market selling mostly fabric or food. They sell everything, but
I know I've been
in
to Ghana.
particular,
I
I was
love
also
it.
going there.
They do sell everything.
Yeah,
hmm I
yep,
mean,
they sell everything.
I arrived in
How I
Ghana with luggage that got delayed for 6 days. So I had to shop for clothes in the market, which meant that they had to make them for me because I am not a tall, thin Ghanaian woman.
and they make it really fast
Oh,
and
yeah.
efficiently.
15 minutes and
Hmm.
I had an outfit. And I remember
Hmm.
my guide and the driver were just so thrilled when I was wearing the costume of the land. And I said, well, that's cool. I liked it, but it was nice that they said, oh, it's so nice to see you dressed. So
Oh
that
yeah,
was really wonderful.
they love that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, a lot of their fabric, of course, is imported, even though it's their
Hmm.
designs, which is interesting. I
Hmm.
didn't realize that till I visited there. But they do make the different kinds of cloth, though. So, did you visit the places like the Kente cloth? And I'm trying to think of the name of the one where it's stamped.
Yeah, batik. Yeah, so 2 years ago now, well, not last summer, but the summer before, I did an extensive research trip to kind of collect all of the fabrics. So I went to Senegal, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, and then Ghana. And I went to all of the Kente centers in Ghana. I made batik, and I also went up to the mountains in Togo where they do the indigo fabric dyeing.
Ah,
And that was really interesting. And I've also traced a lot of the wax fabric there too to different centers in China
uh-huh.
that produce them. So that's kind of
Okay.
where the research behind my work comes from.
Yeah. Well, really probably fascinating to watch. I mean, I visited and watched kente cloth being made and then the stamped fabric in Ghana with the Adinkra designs on it.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's I'm remembering okay. That's good. And so you took those kind of experiences and that's where I've seen some you've had like almost like quilts with the different fabrics that you've sewn on.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also the project is also part performance too, because I only use the knockoff fabric because the work is about how China is kind of colonizing both Africa and the Caribbean. So on the island I grew up on in particular, there's been a lot of Chinese corporations that have come in and they practically own most of the island at this point. And the process is the same that they've used all over the world. And so to be able to get the women to sell me the fabric that I want, and let me interview them, it's taken years of relationship building and the same women helping me. So when I bring the fabric back, I separate the fabric and catalog it very carefully to keep track of which woman sold me the fabric and where she's located, so that the works act as portraits as well.
Ah, that's cool. Very interesting. Do you think one of my things I'm interested is when you're getting involved into a new process, I mean, you're using that to express yourself, but does the process somehow change what you're thinking and the art, as well as taking your ideas into the process?
Yeah, I mean, I have studio assistants, and when I was in Ghana, I was thinking about all of this amazing work I wanted to do. The first thought I had was I would really like to sew into wood. And when I was in Ghana, I was talking about it with one of the women in Cape Coast that I buy fabric from. And she was like, if you're making work about how our labor is exploited, you can't pay someone else to do that. You have to drill all of the holes yourself, and you have to sew it yourself. And she said that to me with a straight face, but I had laughed and she kept her face straight. And I was like, oh, okay. So now the work is all of the work that touches the African wax fabric that's one of the rules that I follow, is that I have to be the one to drill the holes and I have to be the one to sew it. And I've kept that rule-based art making process for everything I do. And so when I'm interacting with people to make the work, I take into account what they say, which also changes the process on a daily basis.
That is very interesting. Yeah, I was wondering how that might transform. That's really good. And then obviously, we're going to direct people to your website to check out some of your art. So I think we probably should tell them about that right now.
Yeah, it's just aprilbey.com.
aprilbey.com. So that will take people to your art and to connect with you and things like that, right?
Absolutely.
And how would you describe what they're going to find there?
I mean, they're going to see all of my recent work. If they click on I have links there to my social media. If they go to Instagram, they can actually see photos and videos that I've taken when I was in Ghana and all over.
That's good. I think I glanced at that, but I do need to explore that more myself. And because you have earlier work on there as well as your current project. Right. So how would you say your work has evolved or what did you start off with creating now that you've moved into these, the idea of women's work in Africa and the Chinese? But when you started, you said something about Beyonce, and that was earlier work, right?
Yeah. I still do a lot of work with feminist themes in them. Feminism kind of merging into womanism. So my earlier work kind of starts out with black hair, because I went through a transition phase where I stopped chemically straightening my hair and let it grow naturally. So I have a lot of work about the millennial natural hair movement on YouTube, where I was painting with hair relaxer and doing chemical tests under a microscope. And then I started moving into Beyonce feminism and hashtag corporatist feminism and how it was selling really well. And then it morphed into what I'm working on now.
Well, yeah, I think that's an interesting story for all artists, is just how you let things push your art.
Mm-hmm.
And so what kind of advice do you give to your students who are starting off in an art career? People who might be listening who are thinking, I want to start getting into art.
The first thing I tell my students is to do it for the right reason. Don't do it because someone is telling you should do it and they don't really know the work that goes into it, and to not set unrealistic expectations, to be as realistic as possible, because it's not easy. You will have to work jobs so that you can go home at the end of the day and do what you love. But eventually the hard work pays off. And then I also tell my students, if you're not thinking about art every day, doesn't matter if you have a studio or if you're in your studio or even if you're making art, but an artist thinks about art every day.
I think that's very true. And very good advice. So that's a very good point for people who are thinking about art. Yeah, is to be thinking about art all the time. And did you have particular mentors along the way, or did you feel like you were kind of pushing this all yourself, or how did you, really helped shape you in your art career?
I have tons of mentors. I didn't really grow up with a solid family, in particular, a father. So I have a lot of father figures all over LA. Tom Nechtel at Art Center in particular was a really big mentor for me, helping me figure out which grad school to go to. He visited me a lot while I was in grad school to help me with my studio practice. He helped me get a job after grad school. He gives me a lot of advice. When I sold my first painting and the collector was lowballing me, and he helped me negotiate that. And I have a graduate mentor, Samantha Fields, who's an amazing painter. There's a lot of people that mentor me. I have mentors in the UK. She was my first chair at Art Center. Banalyn Green, she's an amazing filmmaker, but also one of the original students at the first feminist art program in Fresno. There's few women who were working with Judy Chicago that have mentored me on feminism and navigating the space. It's a mod podge of people all over the place I call them mentors. I don't know if they would call me a mentee, because a lot of them see me as their equals or in the same space as them, but I look up to them and ask for their advice all the time.
Well, it sounds like you've had some wonderful mentors, and I think that's really important along the way is finding people who can really help you figure these things out, because it's not all straightforward. And
yeah, exactly.
Finding your path in art. Now, do you have any ongoing public shows or anything planned here in the near future?
Well, next week I'm flying out to North Carolina for biennial type show called Black on Black. And that opens February 1st. And I also have a show opening up, I think, in Huntington Beach here in March, right after that show. So I'm just kind of working on art to get ready for those shows.
Oh, sure. But those are places where people could go and see some of your work in person.
Absolutely.
I like to inform people about that when I'm talking to an artist. And there comes a time in every interview where you're thinking, now, did I ask all the questions I was planning to ask? Mm-hmm. So I think I've gotten to that. I suppose, well, it sounds like one of the things I'm always interested in is like how our early education shapes our experience. But it sounds like in the Bahamas, there's some real encouragement for art. Is there, yes. Do you think because there's a lot of arts and crafts within the islands, or how do you think that came to be such a big focus? Because, I think in American schools, art's kind of, every now and then people say, oh yeah, art's important, but it really does get pushed to the back and out of the way in many cases as not very significant. So what do you think has made that an important factor in education where you're from?
Well, we have a parade that happens for Christmas and New Year's called Junkanoo. It's where we essentially collect junk, trash, cardboard stuff all year, and groups of teams of artists get together and put them together to form costumes and instruments, and they parade all night, and it's a competition. So it's very competitive. So I think that is built into our education system so a lot of students end up going to these groups and competing. So we have a major art event that's based on competition. That's part of our culture that I think the schools groom us for, because a lot of the assignments, if I can remember correctly, were very geared towards being able to make something out of nothing. And have proper color theory. Our whole island kind of looks like an art project because our houses are, hot pink.
Right, and lovely colors.
And so it's ironically built into our culture, but once you get out of high school, you have to get a job either in the tourist industry or the banking industry. There's not really an art space. We don't have a traditional school we have the University of the Bahamas now that offers an AA in art, but in any event, you still would always need to leave the island if you wanted to pursue art professionally.
So yes, and the colors in the Caribbean, and they tend to be the pastels or bright, vivid kind of colors. What's interesting, of course, is because places like Ghana have lots of painted houses, but they paint a lot of flags and a lot of symbols and logos that are meaningful to them on their homes. I noticed. Yes. I don't know. Do you notice any other differences in that? It's somewhat the same kind of thing, but it's different. It's very regional. to the area.
Yeah, and Ghana and the Bahamas are very similar because we have the same climate and we were also colonized by the British last.
Right.
So our culture is very similar. They tend to be more colorful with what they wear. So everyone has on different prints. And when you look at decorations within the hotels, there's a lot of their arts and craft and African arts and craft tends to be really loud. Whereas Bahamians, we don't have a lot of crafts other than maybe decorating seashells for tourists or doing postcard art. Call it postcard art. I mean, we have Junkanoo, but our thing is Junkanoo. And ironically, Junkanoo derives from Ghana. Like they've had parades, masquerade parades that Junkanoo originates from.
Well, I think that'll be an interesting story that I will have to tell. I am currently going to be attending the Association for Creative Industries, which is basically the Craft and Hobby Association. And there are several people here who are mixed media artists who've been exploring some spots here in Phoenix that sell some good junk to make some of their creations. And then they have little competitions. Of course, they have, the craft products that will be available, but people can use some interesting surprise elements and stuff in this, but there'll be competitions for making jewelry, I think, this year. Sometimes there's been fashion. So there are a number of people who take that, but I don't know if many of them know the story of what happens in the Bahamas. So I really like that story, something to pass on here.
Please.
Well, that's a really neat, but that, do you think that whole tradition is something affects how you do some of your mixed media art? That uses already commercial fabrics, but you kind of incorporate just what's around you, right?
Yeah, and it's also in the way I make too. So nothing ever goes as planned. Nothing ever happens as planned. Sometimes I work with resin sometimes, that will just melt pigment and gotta grab whatever's near you and throw it in. And that's very similar to how Junkanoo artists work. You work with what you have.
Yeah, that is really awesome. Very good. Well, I must say I have enjoyed searching, my whole introduction to April, to the listener, to tell you, is that I was in a gallery class and we had an assignment to find some artists to suggest for gallery shows. And so I explored some California artists and California women artists, and I came across April, and I was just thrilled. I found your art really, really spoke to me. It was very interesting, and I said, this is someone I have to choose for my assignment. So I found your art just really, really spoke to me. So I hope that others will find that to be true too and check you out.
Thank you. I'm so honored.
Yeah, well, it has been a delight to talk to you. And one of the things that I always end my podcast with is asking people about their general thoughts about creativity, because this is, of course, a creative approach, and you've told us a lot about that. But if you could kind of synthesize it down into just a couple of statements or something about creativity and what it means to you.
Creativity to me means learning the rules so you can break them.
Very good. I like that one. It's definitely a good thing. Yes, because I think knowing why art is done a certain way and then gives you an appreciation when somebody can have their own unique approach. I like that very much. Well, exactly. I have really enjoyed speaking with you today. And I don't know if you had any other thoughts or anything else I should have addressed here today, but I've enjoyed this conversation a lot.
No, this was great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, very good. Well, as I said for the listener, you can go to www.aprilbey.com, and there you can find art and links to April's creative world and her creative approach. So thank you very much, and we'll say goodbye and hope everyone will check out your art.
Thank you.
So thanks very much for the interview today. So wonderful to talk to you, really.
Thank you for listening. It's always such a pleasure to have these conversations with creative people who are passionate about their art. Do visit the show notes at acreativeapproachpodcast.com to learn more and to find links to images of April Bey's art. While at the website, do sign up for the email list. You'll find you can send audio feedback on the website too. When online, please visit and join our Creative Approach podcast page. Your questions and feedback on the show are welcome on our feedback group page, so do join there as well. Just a reminder to become a subscriber to a Creative Approach podcast on your favorite podcast platform if you've not done so already. The podcast is available on most, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Pandora. And you can always ask Alexa or Hey Google to play the podcast too. Alexa, please play a Creative Approach podcast. If you'd like to support the show with even $1 a month, your generosity would be most welcome. You can do that by going to the Patreon tab on the website. Please join me at a Creative Approach podcast in future conversations where I hope you will find inspiration to make things, tell your story, and explore a creative approach to life.